Okay, so we are nearing the end of this semester. We only have this week and next week left, and then you guys are done. Just a reminder that today is the last day to submit your gallery review. It's due at midnight tonight. After that, it's going to be late, and I can only accept those late, even late, which will be a point deduction up to the 2nd of December because I got to get grades done for your finals. So please plan on turning that in today on time. Also, your last big assignment, which is the quiz over chapters 18, 19, and 20, is due on the 4th, which is this Friday. You can go ahead and do that one. It's unlocked. It's been unlocked since last week. So make sure to go ahead and get that done. The sooner you get that done, the sooner you can just focus on your final exam, which is what I recommend doing. As for your final exam, that will open. It is an online test, just a heads up. That'll open as soon as class is done on Wednesday, and it will be open until that Thursday at midnight. If you want to take it in class on Thursday, for those of you that are here, that'll be an option for you to do as well, but it is online, so if you need to bring a computer for that, you might want to keep that in mind. Any questions about your gallery review, your quiz, or your final? Yes.
You do the quiz all at one time?
Yes, you have to do the quiz all at one time. You can't log on and log off and log back on. Any other questions? Anyone online have questions about how to do any of your last assignments? Okay, this week we're going to be going over the last few chapters. Then next week we'll focus on finishing up. Usually I have to split chapter 24 into 2 parts and 25. And then on Wednesday we will be doing a review of material before your final exam. That's what I like to do on Wednesday. And on Wednesday next week, I also give you your long essay question ahead of time for anyone that's interested in working on it before they take the test. So keep that in mind. You're going to want to come next Wednesday. Let's go ahead and get started on today. I suppose I should go back to the beginning. Okay. Gotta get used to this sharing thing again. It's like every time I take a break from sharing, I forget how to do it for some reason. But this week we are starting our Academy Art section. So around the 1800s, Academy or academic art is popularized. Last we talked about the Western art world. It was primarily the church that was funding and controlling the art, as well as patrons. We are now entering into the territory of the gallery, being what deems what is popular and what is not popular in the art world. The original term for a gallery was a salon, and in a salon they would just have works on top of works on top of works. The entire wall would be lined from artworks from top to bottom, and it was just their fancy term for a gallery. And what was allowed into these galleries or salons was decided by the Academy of the Arts, or the École des Beaux-Arts, School of Arts. The School of Arts is going to go against some of the popular artworks that we're used to seeing today, but they had very specific rules, and those rules are going to be popping up throughout the lesson today. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and introduce that School of Arts now. So other things that are happening besides the Academy of Arts taking away the role of the church and the patrons from the Renaissance is that we are entering the era of the British Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, and the French Revolutions. So there is a lot going on in the world at this time, and the art is going to reflect those different themes that are popping up. For example, with American arts, America will be soon entering the age of westward expansion. So a lot of their art is going to be based off of showcasing that wilderness that America possesses and Europe does not. And as for the French revolutions, a lot of their art is going to be based around illustrating liberty and freedom, particularly from the monarchy. We're also entering into the age of reason for this section, or the age of enlightenment. So there's a lot of rational and scientific approaches and beliefs coming forth, such as transcendentalism, which is another popular theme in America at the time, which is the celebration of nature, as well as individuality. So there is a lot of individuality that is going to be popping up in this era, particularly towards the end of it. There's also stylistic pluralism, meaning there's more than one style that's happening at the same time. For example, the first style that we're about to talk about is Romantic and Neoclassical. Those two styles were happening at the same exact time. So there's two styles happening. There's going to be multiple styles happening throughout this time period. It's not like before when we're talking about, well, here's the Romanesque era of architecture, and that leads into the Gothic era, and that leads into such and such and such and such. Now we're going to have multiple styles happening all at once. And like I mentioned, the traditional sources of patronage and the church being rich, wealthy merchants and the church buying art and kind of pushing what was going to be popular as far as themes, that has died out, and instead the academy has taken over, and that Academy of Arts or School of Arts is going to deem what is appropriate in the art world now. Some of the things that the Academy of Arts or the School of Arts deems appropriate are classical themes from Greek and Roman art. So we're going to see once again a continuation of the rebirth of Roman and Greek ideas in art. However, it is now garnered the title of neoclassicism. Neoclassicism just means new classical. So we are going to see a lot of artwork in that style in the early 1800s, which is the time period that we're talking about right now. So neoclassical is appropriate according to the École des Arts or School of Arts, as long as it follows that classical style, meaning it should have some allusion to a mythological or Roman historically accurate story. The figures should all be wearing Roman or classical clothing. Those are some terms that need to fall under neoclassicism. Also, the architecture in the background should allude to classical architecture, which is exactly what David's Oath of the Horatii does. It is a story from Roman history about the virtues of giving one's life for what you believe in, particularly in this sense, the Roman Republic or the government. There is a sculptural quality to these particular figures, which alludes back to classical sculpture, which you can see there. I will move this over and enlarge it for our people. So we are now entering the era of primarily paintings as well. I should mention that we're only going to be occasionally touching upon sculptures. It's not that people weren't doing sculptures, it's just that most of the masterpieces from this era are paintings rather than any other art form. And Jacques Louis David is a French painter working in the neoclassical style. Once again, this falls under neoclassical because it is a story from Roman history. You see the classical architecture being echoed in the background with the columns and the arches. and they're all wearing classical clothing. And of course, like I said, it does showcase giving one's life to your government or something that you believe in. So here we see three sons pledging their lives to their country. They're about to go off to fight war, and that is their father there receiving their pledge. They're basically honoring their father and their government in this image. And you see their wives and children in the background crying. It's around this time period as well that we should make a note that most governments are trying to depict women as mothers and encourage them to become mothers and showcase them as solely homemakers that are in charge of raising children. That's because this is around the time when the first wave of feminism is popping up over in Europe. So the governments are opposed to women gaining the right to vote over in Britain and France. So they're showing them these images to try and encourage them, okay, this is what a woman should be, which is a homemaker who's in charge of raising children. And that's another theme that's going to carry over into Angelica Kauffman's works. So at this point in time, like I said, there's the École des Beaux-Arts or School of Arts that is in charge of everything that is being shown off in the art world. They also decide who gets to go to art school, and normally women are not admitted. Angelica Kauffman, however, is a rare occurrence in this time period for a woman to be able to go to art school, because it was not allowed for women to see nude figures. They did not consider it to be appropriate for a woman to see a naked man or another naked woman. Therefore, a woman would not be able to get the same experience in practicing drawing human figures that would a man. So normally women were not seen in the art world. Angelica Kauffman, however, made her way into the salons and was quite popular with the École des Beaux-Arts, mostly because she followed their rules very well, and she was a wonderful example of neoclassicism. Was she as popular as David? No, but she is a wonderful example of neoclassical art. And we are going to look at Cornelia pointing to her children as her treasures, which also falls in line with the theme of motherhood, which was popular as far as subject matter at that point in time. So it's a bit different in comparison to the Oath of the Horatii. The Oath of the Horatii really celebrates particularly men giving their lives to their government. And Cornelia pointing to her children is more about motherhood and women's abilities. In that time, like I said, the government was trying to convince people to be mothers instead of trying to go out and be equals, get jobs and votes. So this particular image shows the main character, Cornelia, pointing to her three children as her treasures as she has a conversation with another woman who is showcasing her jewelry and showing off her jewelry as her treasures. So basically showing that Cornelia is the bigger woman because she doesn't value her jewels, she values her children. Of course, this is another story from Roman history. And once again, we see classical architecture being showcased in the background, as well as people wearing classical clothing. So another wonderful example of neoclassicism. And of course, neoclassicism also carries over into architecture. So we are going to see an architectural building based upon Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotunda that we looked at last week briefly. So if you remember when we were going over Renaissance architecture, Andrea Palladio is the foremost frontrunner of Renaissance architecture, and I mentioned that he wrote several different books on how to achieve that classical style in your architecture. Well, there's something called a grand tour that's happening at this point in time in history. And a grand tour is when a wealthy male reaches maturity, basically he graduates college, he will then go on a tour around Europe and kind of play around a bit. And one of the things that they would do when they were on these fun little tours is they would oftentimes in Italy pick up souvenirs of Andrea Palladio's book. That was the popular souvenir of that particular area. You would travel to all these different countries and pick up the souvenir from that particular area. And Andrea Palladio's architectural books were the souvenir for Italy. And what ended up happening is all of these white males went back to their respective countries when they were done with their grand tour, and several of them showed off these books, and it ended up garnering a lot of attention in the architectural field and becoming extremely popular for architects to copy Andrea Palladio's Renaissance style, which was an ode to classical style. This is seen quite prevalently in federal buildings in the United States, which is why it's also known as the federal style of architecture. And we can see a wonderful example of federal style besides the White House in Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. The White House is also done in federal style, though. So here you see columns, a pediment, and a dome. As well as pediments in the windows and friezes along the tops of the windows, as well as below the balcony. So this is a more modern interpretation of Palladio's original Villa Rotunda style, but it is still done in a classical style, which is why it's called neoclassical, or if it's done in the United States, the federal style, because we used it for almost all of our federal buildings. Now, in reaction to neoclassicism, at the same moment in history pops up Romanticism. So neoclassicism is very interested in portraying classical figures using classical stories. Romanticism, on the other hand, is more interested in capturing extreme emotional expressions and contemporary events. So there's a little bit more imagination and emotion with romantic art, whereas with neoclassical art, they're trying to capture that classical sculptural familiarity with the classical art styles. And with romantic art styles, on the other hand, they're more interested in emotions and contemporary events. So if you don't remember anything else about Romanticism, remember that they are preoccupied with current events, whereas neoclassical style is more interested in classical issues. We've looked at several romantic paintings before, but I didn't mention that they were romantic because I knew you didn't know what that was then. But we will delve into those now, just a refresher. And the first romantic painting, and one that we have already looked at, is Goya. It is the 3rd of May, 1808. It does illustrate the current event of Napoleon's occupation of Spain. So once again, Romantic is very interested in current events. It is also a bit exaggerated in its facial expressions. It does depict a firing squad of Napoleon's soldiers upon innocent suspects that were ripped out of their home in the middle of the night. There is a lot of mechanical uniformity with the firing squad. You cannot see their faces. They're all dressed identical and they're all firing at the same level at the same time. And of course, they're aimed at very emotional targets. And this was Goya's way of protesting against tyrannical governments like Napoleon's. That's why he created this painting as well as that series. You remember the prince. And here is that painting. So once again, the firing squad They all look relatively the same. You see their guns are pointed at the innocents. We have some lovely linear guidelines to lead us to this particular man, who's also the only one wearing white. That's because he is the focal point for this painting. If we look closely at his hands right here, we see a stigmata. Stigmata is a hole in your hand that alludes to Christ and his time on the cross. So right here, Goya is trying to depict this man as akin to Christ. Christ was an innocent person who was hung on the cross. This man is also innocent. However, he is about to die for his beliefs. And of course, others have already died. So there's a lot of emotion going on in these people's faces and fear. And once again, it is a current event, which is how it falls under romantic. Romantic is another field of painting that was widely accepted by the Academy of Arts. So neoclassical painting was accepted by them, as well as romantic. About art in a second that was not allowed by the École des Beaux-Arts, but this one was accepted. Another example of romantic painting without people and emotions is the burning of the House of Lords and Commons by Turner. And this captures once again a current event. This one happened in London when the House of Parliament caught on fire and burned down. Turner witnessed that fire and decided to capture it. He did so with very loose, expressive brush strokes, which alludes a bit to Impressionist paintings, which also use extremely loose brush strokes. We're going to be talking about Impressionism later because that comes at the very end of the 18th century, and we're still towards the beginning here. But he is a bit of a father or predecessor to those Impressionists. So he has a lot of emphasis on the feelings and emotions that were occurring when people saw their House of Parliament being burned to the ground. But there is not a lot of geography used. In fact, the geography here is not correct. So here is the Thames River. And there is your House of Parliament. And the London Bridge, which is not located there, and also the large cathedral in London, which is not right there. The cathedral is around here. It's like he flip-flopped the cathedral and the House of Parliament. So it's not geographically correct, but it does show the beauty as well as the majesty and power of that fire taking out the main seat of government in Great Britain. And once again, a current event, which is how it falls under romantic. Our next example of romanticism is from America. So Americans are not interested in like newspaper-worthy events like the Europeans were. They were more interested in showing off the majesty of the wilderness that they possessed. So Europe at this point in time had no untamed land. They'd already found everything and destroyed most of their forests, while America was just now embarking upon westward expansion and seeing all of the majesty of the unknown that America had to offer. So a lot of the art illustrates that feeling of grandeur of the wilderness that we possessed. And the first American landscape painter we're going to look at is Thomas Cole, and then we'll take a look at Robert S. Duncanson afterwards. So what happened with these American landscape paintings is these artists would go to these areas and do sketches. Because at this point in time, oil paint was still not portable. You still had to make it yourself. So they would make sketches and then go back to their studios and arrange the compositions the way they wanted to and then paint them. So these paintings are not realistic because they would go make sketches and then pick and choose what they wanted to put in the painting to make an interesting composition. But they sold these to Americans like they were real, like this is what it actually looked like, rather than aggrandizing what it actually was. And what they would do with these paintings is they would go on tours from cities to city, and you would pay a quarter to see them, and they would open a curtain for about a minute, and then they would close the curtain. And if you wanted to see it again, you had to pay another quarter, and then they would open the curtain and then close it. So that's how these particular artists made their money, was by having their artworks go on these tours for showcasing. Thomas Cole's The Oxbow is like the quintessential American landscape painting example. He did it in the Hudson River School style. It wasn't a school of like people going to school, but it was rather a group of artists that were working in a similar style, all from the Hudson River area of the United States. They did all did landscape paintings. It's not like an actual school. Another member of the Hudson River School is Robert S. Duncanson. Robert S. Duncanson was an African American, and he ended up garnering international attention with his illustrations of landscape paintings. And of course, he made a lot of them. So if you want to see any, you just need to go to a museum and you'll probably come across them. Same with Thomas Cole. He did a lot too. So here is Thomas Cole's The Oxbow. I'll make that a little bit bigger. It is a rather large painting. Most of Thomas Cole's paintings are, but here you see the Oxbow River. It's perfect. That's not how it actually looks. Like I said, he did arrange his composition. So here's the Oxbow River. And the way he decided to illustrate this composition is why it's such a famous painting. So this painting's literally split in half. On the right-hand side, you see agriculture happening. There's farmland. It's been plowed. You see the plots of land down below. In the background, right here, you can see a train, another allusion to what's happening in America at this time. We're going through Industrial Revolution, and we have trains that are helping to expand America west. And then perfectly divided, thanks to the storm cloud, we have the wilderness on the left-hand side of this painting. So we have the wilderness shrouded in darkness thanks to the storm, and the pasteurized land in the west has, or not in the west, but on the right-hand side, has the sunlight over top of it. And we can tell this is the wilderness side thanks to what's happening in the foreground. Here we see broken tree limbs and a lot of shrubbery. If you look really close, you can see a cross right here. Thomas Cole always had crosses in his paintings, which is a fun little side note that no one really ever mentions. But there's a cross here. He was very interested in Christianity, so he included that in a lot of his paintings. But this is a great example of westward expansion, the Industrial Revolution, and what was popular in America at that point in time with painting. America is going to stick with landscape paintings for a very, very long time. Mostly because it was the main thing that they had to offer to the world was their wilderness. But Europe will move past that, and we'll see that happening throughout the coming days. Here's Robert S. Duncanson's Blue Hole Little Miami River. Once again, he arranged this composition to make it more appealing to the viewer. This is not how it actually looked, but here we see three men fishing in the Little Miami River, which is illustrated in the background here. This is not my favorite Robert S. Duncanson, but it does show off his ability to use atmospheric perspective to try to make things recede into space. He was wonderful at doing that. Meanwhile, photography is gaining popularity in the world. If you remember when we went over photography's chapter, I mentioned that artists originally were not very receptive of this particular medium. They thought it was going to take their jobs from them because photography is a lot easier to make things look realistic than paintings. It's around this point in time that people realize that artists like Thomas Cole and Robert S. Duncanson are not painting things how they actually appear, but they're arranging the compositions to make them look better. So people like Duncanson and Cole feel very threatened by this. Other artists, however, wholly embrace the medium of photography, such as Timothy O'Sullivan. Timothy O'Sullivan goes around and takes pictures of landscape just the way that Cole and Duncanson painted it. However, unlike Cole and Duncanson, Sullivan would capture things how they actually appeared. So photography in its early phases, which is around what we're talking about today, very cumbersome, heavy, a lot of pieces of equipment come with it. It wasn't portable. It was also very toxic in the beginning stages. So it's interesting to see that people like O'Sullivan would go on these long trips into uncharted wilderness with all of this cumbersome equipment just to take photographs of landscape, which is exactly what Iceberg Canyon is. So O'Sullivan would go and carry all of these heavy camera photography pieces into these interesting places and camp out there for a few days to capture a good image of that landscape, which is exactly what Iceberg Canyon is. And then we'd go back to a studio and develop the film. But we're talking about going around in these areas. There's no roads at the time. We're really using a horse and buggy pretty much. We're not to the Model T era yet. So it's a horse and wagon with really, really heavy, large pieces of equipment in uncharted lands. So it's pretty impressive that he was able to do this and then go back to the studio and find out that he did actually capture something really nice. Because at the time he didn't actually know what he caught on camera. He had to go and develop it. Meanwhile, in Europe, they're using photography a bit differently. In America, we're primarily starting off using it to take pictures of landscape like O'Sullivan's. In Europe, they're using it to take pictures of people. Oh, I know, that's amazing. Which is exactly what we see Nader do with his photograph of Sarah Bernhardt. So his photograph of this actress, she was a very popular theater actress at the time, is akin to a modern day glamour shot. So once again, Bernhardt was an actress. She would want to have her photograph taken so that she could get more roles to show them to people. So it literally was a glamour shot to try and help her get more parts in place. And Sarah Bernhardt had been illustrated many, many different ways before. She's been in paintings, she's been in prints, and finally in 1855, she was captured in a photograph, which is quite a bit different than the way she looks in her paintings and her prints. If you remember some of the Alphonse Mucha prints that we've looked at, such as the one with the jewels or the precious stones, with the woman and a flower and a snake in the front, those were all images of this woman. So they're very different in comparison to what she actually appeared as. And lastly, at the same time as neoclassical and romantic art, we have our third art style, which is realism. Realism was not accepted by the Salon or the Academy. So neoclassical was widely accepted by the Academy of Arts. Romantic style was widely accepted by the Academy of Arts. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention when we were going over romantic, that first popped up in poetry and writing. So if you're interested in checking it out and you're more interested in literature, Mary Shelley worked in romantic style of literature, so Frankenstein is considered a romantic, which is not romantic, but it's romantic as far as the sense of the theme that it was supposed to be written under, which is interesting. And I forgot to mention that. And there's a lot of poetry, for example, a majority of the poetry by Byron is under the romantic category. But that's a little side note. Our third style that pops up is realism. It was not accepted by the Academy. It did not go along with their rules or formulas that they laid out. It broke most of those rules. Therefore, a lot of artists that worked in the realist style were not allowed to exhibit in salons for really dumb reasons. But hey, most realist art is depicting everyday life. The first image we're going to look at is people working on a road. At this point in time, if you were going to go to a salon, you had to pay to get into the door. If you were a paying customer, would you want to pay money to go into a salon and see a painting of road workers? No, you wanted to see a painting of a mythological story or a romantic painting of a current event, not everyday life of people working on a road, which is one of the main reasons why realism was not accepted by the Academy. Also, it broke their hierarchy, which you don't really need to know about, but there is a hierarchy as far as size of paintings. And at the top, the only things that were allowed to be really, really large paintings had to be a historical event or a mythological story. And this guy, Gustave Courbet, is going to do a really, really big painting of people breaking up roads so they could pave a new road. Once again, not exactly an entertaining subject matter. So like I said, this style depicts the ordinary without idealizing it, without any exoticism or difference or new thing or any nostalgia. It was a reaction by the artists to both neoclassicism and romanticism. And it was their way to say, look at this everyday subject matter that's happening. We're trying to capture your attention, which is why most of them are on such a large scale. They were wanting to gain media attention. They were wanting to go against the art rules. That was their main purpose. They were trying to break the rules and capture everyone's attention. Because we are about to enter the era of art in which it's all right to get bad media attention, because it's still media attention. It's still getting your name in the paper, good or bad. It's still getting your name in the paper, and they're still getting attention, even though it's negative. So Gustave Courbet is very well known for his controversial paintings. You might have come across him in your censorship project. He did a very interesting painting of a woman with her legs spread really wide open, which is like Birth to the World or something like that. I can't quite remember the title. But that was in the early 1800s, so quite an inappropriate time to be doing that. But he did it and it garnered him a lot of attention. In fact, it's one of the first works that is censored, like full on censored, because people find it extremely inappropriate. He was also a bit censored for the Stonebreakers, but the Stonebreakers does not have any pornographic imagery. It is just an image of ordinary road workers breaking up stones so that they could pave a road there. There's no dramatization, there's no exaggeration of emotion, there's no struggle. It is just an older man and a younger man breaking up stones. That's it. This particular painting was lost during World War II thanks to bombings. So this is just a photograph that we have left now. Gustave Courbet eventually is kicked out of all salon exhibitions. So if he wants to show off his work, he has to pay for his own space and have his own private exhibition, which is exactly what he does. Most art critics claim that he is raising a cult of ugliness with his art style. And a lot of people are claiming that his artwork is socialist in nature. In fact, even today, people still claim that it's a bit socialist. So socialism is usually equated to communism. Communism is all about everyone doing their part and working for the greater good of the country. So showing people doing a job is usually subject matter that we will see in communist art later on. But Courbet does set up his own exhibitions. There are other realism artists that we're going to talk about today that do the same thing because they are not allowed to show their artwork in the salons. And Courbet is one of the first artists in history to take oil painting outdoors. It is that point in time, around 1850, that we see the invention of portable oil paint tubes. So artists are going to start painting in plein air, which just means outside. And we also see the beginnings of artists trying to capture their first impressions, which I'm sure you, if you're really, really clever, you know where this is going eventually. Another artist working in the realism style is Rosa Bonheur. She paints a lot of horses in her subject matter. Rosa Bonheur came from a wealthy family. She is a female. So another rare example of a female artist that was able to make it in the art world. She did not go to art school. She is self-taught. And she went to the horse fair. So the horse fair was a place it's another everyday subject. It's just an auction where people would buy and sell livestock or horses. So if you're familiar with like 4-H shows, that. So she would go to these auctions, which women were not allowed to go to. Only men were allowed to go to these auctions or these horse fairs. Because there was a lot of vulgar language that was used in drinking and they didn't feel like it was an appropriate place for women to attend. So number one, if she got caught going to these horse fairs, she would get thrown in jail. So what she did to not get caught is she cross-dressed as a man, which is another thing illegal to do for women at this time. Women are not allowed to wear pants. Yeah. It's illegal for women to wear pants at this point in history. She did end up going to jail several times for it, and she was fined many, many times. Luckily, she came, like I said, from a wealthy family, so they would just bail her out. But yeah, so she went there because she thought horses were extremely beautiful subject matter. She liked to show off their muscular structures in her paintings and the energy that the horses had, which is exactly what she depicts here in this large painting of the horse fair. So here you just see the horses are circling the ring. Eventually they'll be pulled out one by one for people to inspect, but showcasing the power and the energy of these horses. And fun little fact, there is a self-portrait right here. This is Rosa Bonheur looking directly at us in the center, which is not actually where she would have been. She would have been off in the side back here, looking and spectating. And another example of realism, this one is another African-American artist. This is Tanner's The Banjo Lesson. So the Banjo Lesson, well, all of Tanner's artworks are about dignifying the portrayals of everyday African-American lifestyle. So we're going to look at a painting of a grandfather giving a banjo lesson to a grandson in their modest home. So everyday life scene. Once again, we see a very loose painterly brushstroke being used here. If we look at the date 1893, The Impressionists have already started working at this time, and Henry Osawa Tanner has been influenced by their particular art style. There's a female artist that is part of the Impressionist group that we'll talk about in a second, named Mary Cassatt, and she would always do mother and child paintings where the mother is holding the child on her lap. So it's a very similar compositional style as to what she was using, as well as brush style. I meant to remove this one. No, I didn't. Yes, I did. I meant to remove that one. Sorry. It went back with the romantic. This is a romantic painting. It's a painting of a current event that Gericault read about in the paper. And that takes us to our last realist artist, Edward Manet. Edward Manet is known as the father of Impressionism. He did not work with the Impressionist artists, but he's known as the father of Impressionism because he's the last real big artist that completely breaks away from the salon and is able to garner success despite being separate from them. He is a realist artist. And the way he works is he combines very flat Japanese style prints. If you remember our woodblock prints from last week, he paints like that. So it's very, very flat. He does know how to paint things with depth and dimensionality. He just chooses not to. He wants to develop his own style, which is separate from what the Academy is teaching at this point in time. So he takes on painting things in a very flat manner. He breaks a lot of rules. So the example of Edward Manet that we're going to look at is Luncheon on the Grass. In Luncheon on the Grass, there are naked women surrounded by clothed men. There is no allegory or classical mythology to this story. So that's strike number one for Manet, is why are there two naked women with two clothed men in the middle of nowhere and it's not a mythological story? Why? Why? That's not appropriate. If it had been a mythological story, then yes, it would have been fine, but it is not. Also, the flatness and the lack of depth and dimension irritated a lot of viewers just because it goes against the Academy style of teaching. We can really see the flatness in the trees here, as well as this man's coat. There's a little bit of depth in the shadows, but not much. If you remember the reclining nude Olympia from the beginning, that's another example of Edward Manet's works. He also has them looking directly at the viewer, and the only reason why that would be acceptable is if it was a self-portrait, and it is not. Also, his perspective is off. If he was using proper linear perspective, this woman in the background would be a lot smaller. And he exhibited this painting with patches of canvas peeking through in the background, meaning it is not completed. But he showed it in the salon anyway. This is the painting that gets Edward Manet kicked out of the salon. After this painting, he ends up having to exhibit on his own and pay for his own space. Like I said, Edward Manet is the father of Impressionism, and he inspires another group of artists known as the Impressionist artists to form a group and organize their own independent exhibitions in 1873. So this group of artists was denied access to exhibiting in the regular salon, which is sponsored by the Academy of Arts. Therefore, they decided as a group to purchase a space and exhibit their artwork there. They exhibited for several years. It is a very specific group of artists, and they only did painting. They're given the name Impressionists because they caught impressions of what the eye sees. They took those tubes of oil paint and would take them out to these places and paint things as they saw them. So they're working very, very quickly, trying to capture things as fast as possible. as they see them, their very first impression of these images. So these artists are working outside and capturing things immediately. Because they're capturing things very quickly, their brushwork is very loose and painterly. They also use an impasto style, which means it's very thick and butter-like as far as the oil paints. They aren't adding a lot of turpentine to it to thin it out. And of course, our first example of Impressionism is Claude Monet's. Manet is the father of Impressionism, and Monet is the artist that gets them their name. And here is the arrival of the Normandy train. So similarly to the realism artists, they captured everyday life, but they captured their very first impressionism of it. Realism artists typically would take sketches and studies of their artworks and then go back to the studio and work out a composition there. Impressionist artists did not do that. They painted it immediately on site. And the term Impressionism is given to these artists by critics thanks to Monet's Impressions Sunrise. It was just a title that Monet used because it was his impression of a sunrise, his first impression of a sunrise. The term was originally meant to be derogatory, however, the artists themselves found it to be very fitting and they accepted it wholly. Impression sunrise is comprised of small dabs of color and separate strokes that are blended when you are farther away from the painting. It is pure swatches of color, not mixed together, which allows for more vibrancy. And the Impressionist artists are extremely optimistic about new technology, particularly oil paints and tubes. Because without oil paints and tubes, Monet would never have been able to capture this. So this is just once again his impression of a sunrise over a lake. Very quick, fast brushstrokes. Another artist that's working with the Impressionist group, meaning he's a member of the group, is Auguste Renoir, as well as Edgar Degas. They are both members of the Impressionist group. Renoir likes to do paintings of outdoor settings and events. So that's exactly what Les Moulins des Galettes is. Les Moulins des Galettes literally translates to pancake house. So this is a popular event for Sunday afternoons for the middle class. Is they would go to these pancake houses, which provided live music and dancing, and just eat together and dance and enjoy the music. So it was a Sunday afternoon middle class leisure activity to do that most people partook in. And it's Renoir's first impression of what he saw that day. He took the paints to the area and painted it as he saw it. Edgar Degas, however, was the only Impressionist artist that did not paint on site. He did do studies and he would go back to his studio and paint in his studio. He did indoor settings, which is quite different from both Renoir and Monet. He would primarily paint ballerinas. And his painting style is more akin to street photography or someone taking pictures of events versus impressions or first impressions. Well, I mean, street photography is first impressions, but we know that he composed his images the way he wanted. But first, here is Auguste Renoir's painting of the pancake house. So once again, there's live music in the background, people enjoying each other's company and a lot of dancing. Once again, a very loose brush stroke, not quite as loose as Monet's, but it's still a light, feathery brush stroke. And of course, Edgar Degas' The Ballet Class, which shows the unglamorous life of a ballerina. Today, we associate ballerinas with glamour and beauty. Back then, that was not something that you would want your daughter to do. We're talking about the time period, 1870s, 1880s, in which most women wear so much clothing that you can't even see their ankles. And these ballerinas, you can see their pantaloons. So ballerinas were very sexualized at this period in time. In fact, old men would frequently go to their practices just so they could peek up their skirt, which is exactly what we see painted here. There's an old man who is spectating so that he can look at these girls. And that is what Edgar Degas mostly painted in his ballerina paintings. So they look like they're pretty innocent paintings, but on closer inspection, you realize that almost all of them are a bit gross. But I mean, Edgar Degas is also frequenting these establishments, and he is an older man. So yeah. And here, if you're wondering what this woman is doing in the front, that is one of the mothers of these girls. She's going there to supervise to make sure nothing happens to her. Oftentimes the mothers would do that to protect their daughters. And speaking of mothers, we have Mary Cassatt. I mentioned Mary Cassatt earlier with Henry Osawa Tanner. Mary Cassatt only painted images of mothers and children, only. She's very interested in motherhood. And this is the boating party. The boating party was an actual event in which Mary Cassatt painted her friend holding her son as they were on a boating trip. So here's the mother and child, the man rowing the boat, and on the other side of this boat, in the seat that we can't see, is Mary Cassatt. So she actually went on this trip with them. So Impressionism, the group of artists, which we just mentioned, all of them is Cassatt, Renoir, Degas, and Monet. Those are all of the Impressionist artists. There are not any more of them. There's only the four. They disbanded in 1886, and they did not show together again after that. They were still making art post that in the Impressionist style, but they did not exhibit together. An artist that's working in a similar manner to the Impressionist group, but is not an Impressionist, I repeat, he is not an Impressionist, is Auguste Rodin. Auguste Rodin is a sculptor. The Impressionist artists are only painters. Auguste Rodin, the sculptor, however, did work in a similar style to the Impressionists, but he was not an Impressionist. He was working separately. The Impressionists are a group of artists that exhibited together. Auguste Rodin is not one of them. He did not exhibit with them. However, he does work in a similar manner. Particularly, he would work the same way Michelangelo did with his unfinished slave pieces. So his pieces look very rough and unfinished. And of course, the main sculpture of Rodin that most people equate with him is the Thinker. The Thinker is made of bronze. He also worked in the medium of plaster and clay. In fact, he made molds of all of his sculptures, and the molds still exist today. And sometimes his family will make new versions of Rodin's sculptures using Rodin's mold and make money off of them if they need some money. They do that on occasion. But this is the Thinker. So we can see very loose, almost painterly-like quality to this sculpture. You can almost feel or get the sense of the idea of where he probably on his clay mold put his hands and his fingers. It doesn't look as pristine as classical sculptures do. It looks more like Michelangelo's unfinished sculptures. And weird thing about Rodin that I always find very interesting is he did really, really large hands and feet on all of his sculptures. So here you can see the Thinker's hand, huge. That takes us to post-impressionism, which is the last thing we're going to talk about today. So post-impressionism does not share a single style. It's just artists' reaction to impressionism. Eventually, impressionism garners a lot of attention, and a bunch of artists start working in that style. And other artists become sick and tired of seeing impressionism, so this is their reaction to that. Such as George Seurat. George Seurat decided that he wanted to make the next trend of art following Impressionism. And he thought that that particular trend was going to be divisionism or pointillism. Pointillism uses optical color mixture theories to create a whole cohesive painting. So for example, let's say you put a dot of blue paint next to a dot of yellow paint. If you stand far enough back, what happens with your eyes is it makes green. So he's using really, really small polka dots of color to make new colors instead of blending them together on the painting or a palette. And of course, the main George Seurat painting is A Sunday Afternoon on La Grande Jatte. This is not a fleeting moment like the Impressionists. He did months and months worth of sketches and studies to come up with this composition. And here is that painting. Try and blow it up as big as possible. But Georges Seurat, once again, the inventor of pointillism or divisionism, you can kind of make out that this entire painting is made of polka dots. It's little itty bitty polka dots. In fact, if we get really, really close up on the grass, you will notice that it is polka dots of blue and yellow paint. The areas with more shadow have more blue, whereas the areas in the sunlight have more yellow polka dots. But this entire painting, which is a huge painting, it's just a bunch of polka dots. And every single one of these images are parts of a study that he did, and he put all of them together into this one painting. So every single person was a separate study, and he just stacked them on top of each other. And we know that because we still have his sketchbook. But this is another afternoon event for the middle classes. Oftentimes they would go to the park in the afternoon and enjoy their time. Another post-impressionist artist is Paul Cézanne. Paul Cézanne is trying to go away from impressionism by making things look a little bit more abstract. So impressionist artists are painting things as they see them. Cézanne is still doing that. Particularly with his Mount Saint Victoire series. Mount Saint Victoire was in his backyard. So he would go outside every few days and do another painting of the mountain that he saw from his backyard. So it was his impression of the painting. However, instead of using small, rapid brush strokes, he used large blocks of color, oftentimes with a palette knife. So if you're familiar with like a palette knife, it's used for mixing paint colors together. It's like a spatula. So he basically painted good chunks of these paintings with a spatula instead of a brush. And that is how he gets blocks of color like we see here in Mount Saint Victoire. Now, Edward Manet is the father of Impressionism. Paul Cézanne is going to be your father of Cubism, which you can kind of see. So he's still influenced by the Impressionist artists, but he's trying to take his own spin on it, which is exactly how Seurat was with his pointillism as well. In fact, we can see Seurat working through towards pointillism in his studies. He starts off painting in a more impressionist style, and then he eventually gets to this. Same with Cézanne. Now we're seeing artists that are trying to really develop their own thing instead of following previous trends. That's mostly thanks to the Impressionists breaking down those art rules by the Art Salon and the Academy of Arts. That gone now, thanks to the Impressionists. The Impressionists completely won against their rules and were extremely popular. So other artists are seeing that they don't have to follow a set of rules and they can still be really popular. And that is seen also in the expressionist style of Van Gogh and Gauguin. Expressionists and expressionism is a term that's going to keep popping up as we continue on towards the end of this series. But expressionism just means expressing emotions, be it with using actual facial expressions or colors or bold brush strokes. It's just using, it's basically just painting to express your emotions. So it's going to be quite popular from now on until the end, because most artists today also work in the expressionist style by painting their expressions. That Van Gogh and Gauguin are the early artists to try out this style. Vincent van Gogh was extremely inspired by those Japanese woodblock prints, once again extremely flat. And oftentimes the way these prints compositions were arranged is there would be something blocking out the view in the forefront, such as a tree or a cherry shrub, some random object cutting off your viewpoint, if you remember back to those prints. And Van Gogh was very interested in continuing that idea of using some random object to block off your viewpoint. So here's his attempt at copying a Japanese print in his own style. However, it is not a print, it is an oil painting. And here you can see how he has used a large tree to block off the background, which is a cherry blossom viewing party, which is another Japanese subject matter that's really popular. It's also extremely flat. If you're wondering what these characters say, they don't say anything because Van Gogh made them up. They are not real. He even copied the little cubes, if you remember the stamps when we were looking at Japanese scrolls, those red stamps signified who owned it. He even copied that. Another example of Van Gogh being heavily influenced by Japanese prints is the Sower. Once again, you see the tree in the foreground, very flat depiction. You can also see a lot of influence from Impressionism in this one though, with the loose brushwork used. And that influence from Impressionism continues on in The Starry Night, which is extremely influenced by Impressionism. However, this was not done at a first impression. This was done over a period of time, but it does illustrate Van Gogh's look out of the asylum window. This is what he saw, minus the bars, of course, over the window. And here we see in the foreground is a cypress tree, once again, using foliage to block off your foreground. With that cypress tree. The cypress tree is echoed in the church spire here. If you look at the top of the cypress tree and the church spire. In the not the foreground, but in the background, we see there's a village with trees and homes that are lit up for the night. And then, of course, in the sky, the swirling patterns of the night sky and the stars. This is an extremely depressing image. Cypress trees are symbolic of death. And all of these large swatches of blue and murky colors are representative of his state of mind at the time. Blue itself is a very depressing color, so using large amounts of dark, murky colors kind of symbolize that. Of course, he was in a mental asylum, and eventually he will end up taking his own life. Van Gogh never sold a single painting while he was alive. It was his brother, Victor Van Gogh, who actually ended up making Vincent famous. by going around and getting his paintings into galleries afterwards. Vincent van Gogh, however, was very good friends with another expressionist artist named Paul Gauguin. They were good pen pals. They kept up with each other throughout their life. Gauguin was also not extremely normal, but in a different sense. Gauguin was a stockbroker. His wife came from a very wealthy family, so his wife's father got him a job as a stockbroker at a large bank. So he was making a lot of money, but Gauguin decided to give up all of that lifestyle because he wanted to be a painter. And he worked in that expressionist style. Also very heavily influenced by Japanese prints. Like I said, he and Van Gogh were good pen pals. They wrote each other constantly and they worked in a very similar style. Gauguin, on the other hand, was interested in the exotic or the other. So he oftentimes would go to exotic places and paint the people that lived there, which is exactly what we see in the vision after the sermon. So for this painting, he went to the island of Brittany, which was still made up of a bunch of old style Puritans, which by the 1888 weren't too prevalent. So they were his exotic other at that point in his painting life. And here you see these people in the foreground. They are the Brittany people that have just exited Sunday service. And here you can see the monk or the friar right there. And of course, just like Japanese prints and just like Van Gogh, he has included a tree to block out your view. And in the background, you see the biblical story of Jacob wrestling the angel. Very flat, once again, similar to prints. Eventually, Gauguin will not be satisfied with the exoticism of the Brittany people and he will want to go further. He eventually ends up leaving his entire family and moving to Tahiti. At the age of 43, he completely abandons his wife and child and says bye and moves. So extreme, but not the way Van Gogh is, just a different way of extreme. He continues on with his painting of the exotic and painting things in a very flat manner while he's in Tahiti. He's also extremely influenced by their idea of the language of dreams, which is important to the Tahitian people at that point in time. The idea that dreams have meanings and stories and that your ancestors are trying to teach you things through your dreams. So he oftentimes will paint that in his paintings. He also begins to use colors that are not representative of things that you would really see. For example, you might want to pay attention to the water in this painting here. So obviously this is not what real water looks like. He's used very interesting colors to depict this water. Those colors are going to end up influencing a group that we will talk about tomorrow called the Fauves, who are known for their extreme uses of color. But here we see a depiction of the Tahitian people, once again, very flat, and one of their gods in the background. And eventually that will take us into, I'm just going to skip over this really fast because we've talked about it already. Prints in Paris and the rest of Europe. These prints primarily used for advertising purposes. And one of the primary printmakers at this point in time is Henry Toulouse-Lautrec, who oftentimes would do prints of the Moulin Rouge as well as other theaters that were popping up in the red light district of Paris. For this particular painting, he chose an interesting composition in which he shone a spotlight on this woman's face, making her look like she's wearing a mask when in fact she isn't. He's also cut off half of her face. Here is a self-portrait of Henry Toulouse-Lautrec, surrounded by his friends. Of course, if you were from Paris in 1893, you would be able to recognize who's who. And Henry Toulouse-Lautrec was part of a movement called the Art Nouveau movement in Paris. Art Nouveau literally translates to new art. It was primarily seen in architecture and interior design, but it was also seen in advertising posters, such as the ones that Toulouse-Lautrec did. But it's most attributed to the use of organic and naturalistic shapes in its imagery, such as Victor Horta's Tassel House, which combines architecture with natural forms. We talked about this when we were going over architecture with Antonio Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, as well as the Dragon House. And that takes us to our last bit of post-impressionist period, which is a continuation of expressionism, but we're going into German expressionism. German expressionism was a bit different from regular expressionism because there was more angst involved, or angst. They were more interested in using extreme expressive emotional facial expressions in their paintings, such as Edvard Munch's The Scream, which I'm pretty sure we've all seen. But in this painting, Edvard Munch is portraying his mental state upon watching one of his good friends pass away on their bed. He literally ran out of the house onto the pier and screamed because he couldn't contain his emotions. And this painting captures that moment of his mind at that point in time. So he's trying to illustrate isolation, fear, and loneliness upon watching his friend die. And that soul crying out is what the Scream actually is. This is considered an avant-garde piece. In fact, a good chunk of what we're going to talk about tomorrow is considered avant-garde. Avant-garde just means at the forefront. It was originally a military term used for the front guard. But now we are talking about it in art terms as art that's at the forefront or on the cusp of newness in the art world. And a chunk of what we're going to talk about tomorrow is avant-garde art. But here is the Scream painting for those of you that aren't familiar. So tomorrow we are going to talk about their Blue Rider group, the Foes, and their Bridge group or De Broek group. Those guys are all going to be on your final exam, so come prepared to take some good notes tomorrow. And I will see you all then. Have a wonderful rest of your morning, everyone.
You too. Have a good day.
Thank you, Grace.
Excuse me, Ms. Bragg. Excuse me, Ms. Bragg.
Yeah, Michael?
I'm sorry. I came late because I had issues joining the class.
Oh, it's
So
okay.
I finally got on.
Thank you for letting me know.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Bye, Anna.